Welcome to the klutchkittengaming podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here for episode 55 of the show. Fall is officially here, which means that it's time to pull all of your pumpkin spiced flavored goods out of the attic and prepare for hibernation by playing as many games as humanly possible. Thankfully, that's not difficult at all because we've been inundated with so many top-notch indie and AAA games over the past couple of weeks. As always, I want to remind you really quickly about a couple wonderful ways you can support the show. First off, assuming that you've already subscribed to the podcast, I would love it if you gave the show a 5-star review on iTunes. Even if you're someone who doesn't listen on that platform, it's the most visible and impactful way to leave your comments. Second, if you ever have any thoughts, questions, or game recommendations, make sure you send those my way to klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. In the news this week, the numbers are in. The scientists have agreed. The world leaders have finally come to peace about something. And that something is that spending money is amazing and that monthly subscriptions are the bomb. Oh, wait, that's just what Apple and Google want us to think. I really wasn't wanting to talk much about these, but I think they are important enough to mention. If you were not aware, Apple Arcade was just released the other day and is a monthly subscription service for microtransaction-free mobile games. It's $5 a month, and with it you can play some exclusive and non-exclusive titles like Sayonara Wild Hearts, Sneaky Sasquatch, Frogger in Toy Town, and much more. What is absolutely no surprise to anyone is that Google is going blow for blow by releasing the Google Play Pass. Just like Apple Arcade, it's going to cost $5 a month, and so far it's being said that more than 350 apps and games will be available on the service with no ads or in-game purchases. One big difference between the two services is that Google Play Pass will also include normal apps and not just games, but in terms of games, there are already some big hitters like Monument Valley, Stardew Valley, and Terraria. Another key difference between the service is that Google isn't directly funding development for the games, and they also aren't going quite as hard with the exclusivity factor. In the end, I think it's clear that both of these services bring a lot of value right off the bat, but it's going to be interesting seeing how well they maintain an ever-evolving library of games. As an Android user myself, I don't think I'm going to buy into the service due to already owning a lot of the big titles, but maybe they'll eventually get some apps which I just can't pass up. Let's move on now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Children of Morta, which is a narrative-based roguelike hack-and-slash game which was released on September 3rd for PC and will be released on PS4, Xbox One, and Switch on October 15th. In case you're like how I was a couple years ago when I didn't know the meaning of the term roguelike, let me give you a short explanation. The etymology of the word is unsurprisingly the game Rogue. It came out in 1980, which I'm assuming is before a large portion of us were born, but its impact still lives on today. Over the course of about 28 years, nerds debated what defined a game that is like Rogue, or a roguelike. But thankfully, in 2008, a more widely used definition was settled on, at least by most people. I don't usually spend this much time on genre definitions, but this is fascinating. The Berlin definition essentially lays out a bunch of high and low value factors, which all lend to or take away from a particular game being a roguelike. A few high value factors include random generation of levels, permadeath, turn-based actions, hack and slash gameplay, a grid-based world, and so on. A couple of the low value factors include the player controlling a single character and the game including dungeons, which are essentially levels composed of rooms and corridors. That all seems fine and dandy, but like I mentioned before, some people don't buy into the Berlin definition. For example, Darren Gray wrote an article titled "Screw the Berlin Interpretation," in which he essentially says the definition is antiquated and out of touch with reality. Needless to say, there's a lot of convolution with the term roguelike. In my humble opinion, Children of Morta is less of a roguelike and more of a roguelite. It takes inspiration from The Binding of Isaac, Rogue Legacy, and Risk of Rain. However, it is still missing a lot of those key, high-value factors like being grid and turn-based. In the end, though, my guess is that most of you, including myself, don't really give much of a shit as to whether this game is categorized in the perfect subgenre. The goal of this episode is to talk about whether or not the game is good, so let's move on to that quickly. Children of Morta was developed by Dead Mage, which is a studio that was founded in Austin, Texas in September of 2010. Apart from this game, they've put out a few other projects including Epic of Kings, Shadowblade, and Tale of Ronin. According to HowLongToBeat.com, Children of Morta takes anywhere from 11 to 13 hours to beat. Those estimates are pulling from a relatively small sample size, but they seem to be pretty reasonable, at least based on my experience as well. In terms of controls, I personally used the mouse and keyboard, which worked nicely. You can also use a controller, but the one thing I will mention is that some abilities you don't have quite as much control over. One last comment before we move on to narrative: there is a cooperative option, and I believe online play is in development, but for the sake of the review, my opinion is based on single player alone. Mount Morta was once a beautiful, inviting oasis full of friendly animals, lush vegetation, and breathtaking vistas. Yet something has changed. The god of Mount Morta has been corrupted, and in that corruption has turned all the wildlife into ravaging, evil monsters. For the Bergson family, this is a dire disaster. They live on the mountainside and have been its guardians for generations upon generations. What are they to do? The only solution is to fight their way to the top, to the god of the mountain, in order to understand what sort of deception has infected the deity. Although the overarching plot is about a dangerous journey, Children of Morta is about so much more than that. This game tells the story of a multi-generational family living in a gorgeous mansion on the side of the mountain. Even then, this isn't just a fantasy story about a rich family. It's a narrative that revolves around their intricate relationships. The worry that John and Mary have about their runaway son Kevin. The family's quest to rescue and revive a sick orphan wolf. Linda's violin practice after she finishes slaughtering hundreds of enemies with her bow. If you're anything like me, this isn't the sort of story you expect from a roguelike. Usually you anticipate some sort of village or town to go back to between runs, but generally the narrative quality of these types of games is somewhat lacking. The only other game I can think of offhand that bears a similar narrative weight for this genre is Hades by Supergiant Games. If you haven't listened to my episode about it already, go back and check it out. But my point is that I'm very happy to see a second game this year which has added more soul and feel into a typically mechanics-focused genre. In Children of Morta, you feel like part of this family. Between runs, you're not just upgrading weapons with Uncle Ben or boosting skills with Grandma Margaret. You're watching narrative cutscenes, you're looking around the home for details you previously missed, and you're watching the family go about their daily activities. In addition to those elements of the narrative, the developers also build the world through a couple of other means. First off, every so often you'll run into small scenarios within a run. For example, you might find a boy who lost his mother, and if you choose to escort him, you'll get some sort of reward in the end. Small scenarios like that appear randomly as you proceed through the dungeons, and they help to mix up the gameplay as well as provide some additional context to the world. Second, you'll also find notes and relics as you make your way through the game. They usually have bits of lore which help further build your understanding of what has actually taken place. As you're hopefully seeing, Dead Mage did an incredible job of elevating the narrative quality in this type of game. What's odd is that the overarching plot really didn't mean all that much to me, but I found myself connecting with the Bergsons in a wholly unexpected manner. Now that we know some about the narrative, what's the gameplay like? The core loop is precisely what you'd expect from this sort of game. You choose a character, click on your most recently unlocked dungeon, fight through hordes of enemies until you reach a boss, slaughter the boss or be slaughtered, and depending on which fate you choose, you'll either move on to the next dungeon or be sent back home to upgrade and try again. One of the first questions you might have is how many characters are there to play? You start out with 2 options in the beginning, but as you reach certain levels in the dungeons, you'll eventually unlock 6 playable Bergsons overall. They come in 3 main archetypes, the first being a tank brawler class. In this class you have John and Joey. John is the patriarch of the family who relies on his sword and shield. Not only can he dish out plenty of damage, he can also temporarily block incoming hits in addition to being able to call down swords from the heavens. Joey is John's nephew who wields a large hammer and can deal loads of area of attack damage. Both of these characters have a lot of base health and armor, and as you progress through their skill trees, you can spec John even more towards tank and Joey even more towards bruiser. The second archetype is Rogue and is represented by Kevin and Mark. Both of these characters are quick and nimble and can deal a ton of damage, but your survivability is quite low if you take too many hits. Kevin is the youngest Bergson son who uses his daggers and agility to kill before an enemy can touch him. Later on, he even unlocks the ability to turn invisible for a short period of time. Mark, on the other hand, is the eldest son who prefers the use of peace and inner tranquility as his driving force. Mark is a ninja of sorts who has an incredibly unique basic attack that locks him onto enemies so that he can jump to them and close the gap quickly. As of right now, Mark is definitely one of my favorite characters as his combat style flows so nicely and is quite flexible. The last archetype is a ranged style that both Linda and Lucy have. Linda, the second child in the Bergson family, is my other favorite character right now because she wields an incredibly powerful bow which allows her to kill enemies before they can even get close. The main weakness of the ranged class is close quarters combat. Linda does eventually obtain a stun, which can allow her to escape dicey encounters and kite back, but it's usually a bad sign if you find yourself in that position. Lastly, you can play as Lucy, who is the youngest child overall and who prefers fireballs to arrows. One unique part of her kit is that she can't attack while moving, but as you get further into her skill tree, she can unlock the ability to generate a shield, which significantly buffs her defensive capability. My guess is that as I was going through those characters, at least one of them jumped out to you as interesting. Dead Mage did a great job of creating characters which fit a lot of different playstyles, and what makes it even better is the addition of skill trees for each one. I'm not going to get into the intricacies of all the systems, since there are quite a few going on, but we'd be missing out on a large part of the game if we didn't talk about the skill trees. Like most games, killing things gives you XP, XP gives you levels, and levels gives you skill points. Once you have those skill points, you can spend them on increasingly stronger abilities and passive buffs to the character that you're playing. What's awesome is that the skill trees give you a constant feeling of progression, and although it pushes you to main a character, the game also balances that out by introducing the concept of family perks. Basically what this means is that as you level characters up to a certain point, passive abilities are unlocked for the entire family. Some increase the family's movement speed, others increase the regeneration rate of your dodge bar, others improve critical damage, and so on. The system helps to encourage branching out to other characters at certain points in order to obtain those passives. Let's take a step back now to look at the overarching strengths and weaknesses of the gameplay as a whole. First off, the combat is really enjoyable, especially as you unlock additional abilities and find interesting runes in the dungeons. Fighting hordes upon hordes of corrupted beings is a ton of fun. Second, I really appreciated the overall feel of progression, both temporary and permanent. No matter how far I got into a run or who I was playing, it always felt like I was making some sort of progression in the gameplay and the narrative. Sure, there were those runs where I would have a super dumb death, but it still felt okay since I gained a bunch of XP and learned how to play a character better. Third, I felt as though the difficulty was well balanced. For me at least, each character presented their own unique weaknesses in the context of combat, but combat never felt overly punishing. Generally took me 2 or 3 tries to beat a boss, which felt pretty fair in my book. I know some of you are suckers for pain and would prefer to have to grind out a boss 10 or even 20 times, but I'll be honest, I don't have the care or the time for that kind of bullshit. In regards to gameplay weaknesses, there's really only one that comes to mind. Although the combat is fun, there does come a point where the lack of enemy variety is noticeable. There are new enemies as you progress, but given that you generally have to grind out the same dungeons multiple times, the lack of diversity can become an annoyance. I think the game shores up the weakness with having a good variety of characters to play and having solid progression. However, that still doesn't excuse the problem. Now that we've made it through the narrative and gameplay, let's touch on the art and sound design. The look of this game is truly beautiful. To give you a little context for the art direction, the developers cited that they were inspired by the likes of Hyperlight Drifter, Super Time Force, Crawl, and Nuclear Throne. According to an article I read on TechRaptor by Austin Souther, Children of Morta uses many different techniques to achieve its unique look, including frame-by-frame animations, hand-painted art, and modern lighting techniques. The article and interview with the developers gets really into confusing technical details, but the main takeaway for me is that Dead Mage put a lot of work into this visual style, and that really comes through. Every time I went back to the Bergson's house, I was wowed by how it looked. There's such an odd merging of simplicity with incredible detail that is only truly understood when you see the art for yourself. When it comes to the sound design, it was top-notch overall. As far as I can tell, the only VO is from the narrator, who does an excellent job. His name is Ed Kelly, and the way he conveys the emotion and turmoil that the Bergsons are feeling is incredible. The soundtrack and effects were also solid and complemented the gameplay and tone nicely, but I think Ed did such a superb job that those elements took a back seat in the grand scheme of things. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, the narrative is amazing in the way it tells the story of the Bergsons. It's emotional, inspirational, and makes sense in the general context of the game. Second, the gameplay was fun. The pacing of progression was consistent, and the difficulty was balanced. Third, the art and voiceover in particular are incredibly high quality. It doesn't take much effort to see and hear the effort that was put into developing this game. First off, on the negative side, the overarching plot felt pretty inconsequential. Maybe I wasn't paying attention during some key cutscenes, but there were times where I found myself forgetting what the main goal of the game even was. Second, there could have been a larger variety of enemies. Like I mentioned earlier, the variety of playable characters did help to negate this complaint, but things still could have been improved with a few additional enemy types. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict for Children of Morta is to slay this game. I know, you already have 20 other roguelikes in your backlog, but I would still recommend picking this one up. Whenever I got into a play session with this game, I never wanted it to stop. The way it looked and felt was captivating, and I enjoyed it enough that I'm considering getting it on Switch as well. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. If you find the show to be informative and fun to listen to, make sure you subscribe and tell a friend about it. I hope you have an amazing rest of the day, and I'll see you in game.